My name is Elias Vance. This document serves as a personal record, a deposition of fact against the encroaching fog. I am, or was, a specialist in a very particular field. For 12 years, I served as a corrections officer in the United States military, culminating in a tour at a high-security detention facility that does not officially exist. There, I learned that control is a science and silence is a weapon. But I also learned about the weight of certain actions, the kind that leave a residue on the soul. This residue, a quiet but persistent corrosion, is what clinicians now label moral injury. It is a wound not of the body, but of one's own ethical foundation, a betrayal of the self that leaves you hollowed out, seeking an escape not from the world, but from your own memory. It manifests as a loss of trust in others and in oneself, a persistent shame that erodes the capacity for a full life. It was this hollowness that made the offer so appealing. The contract was presented by a man in a featureless suit in a sterile government office that smelled of nothing. The pay was astronomical, the terms indefinite. The location was described only as a long-term containment and research initiative, operating under the Gerwystone codeword, a designation I later learned was reserved for the deepest of black sites. The work required my specific skill set, the ability to enforce protocol under extreme psychological pressure, and, most importantly, the discipline to exist in absolute isolation. The psychological challenges of such work, including burnout and anxiety, were things I believed I had already mastered. I saw it as a penance, a place where the silence might finally drown out the echoes of my past. I signed without hesitation, believing I was choosing solitude. I was wrong. I was choosing the labyrinth. The journey to the facility was a masterclass in psychological conditioning. It began with a flight on an unmarked jet to a private terminal at the edge of Las Vegas. From there, a black Suburban with tinted windows drove me north, away from the neon glow and into the heart of the Nevada desert. The landscape is a character in this story, an active participant in the isolation it enforces. Nevada is a state defined by the Basin and Range Province, a relentless series of north-south mountain ranges separated by arid, endorheic valleys, closed basins from which no river flows to the sea. It is a topography of entrapment. As we drove deeper into the federally controlled lands of the Nevada National Security Site, NNSS, the world outside the window became a canvas of brutalist nature. The NSS is a place steeped in secrecy, a vast expanse of desert and mountain where the government conducted 28 underground nuclear tests from 1951 to 1992. It is a wounded land, pockmarked with subsidence craters and contaminated with the ghosts of the Cold War, a perfect place to hide things that must never be found. The air itself felt different here, thin and sharp. Nevada is the driest state in the nation, and the Darnall temperature range is extreme, swinging by as much as 40 degrees EF, from the searing heat of midday to the profound cold of the desert night. This constant environmental stress wears on you, a physical manifestation of the psychological pressure to come. The silence was the most unnerving part. It wasn't just quiet. It was a profound, pressing emptiness, a sonic vacuum where the only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the low hum of the engine. We passed signs warning of unexploded ordnance and radiological hazards, markers of a history of black projects and clandestine research. After hours of driving, we arrived at a final checkpoint, a gate in a fence that seemed to guard nothing but miles of creosote bush and sage. Beyond it, half buried in the earth like a concrete tomb, was the facility. They called it Persephone. The name, a reference to the Greek queen of the underworld, was not lost on me. The structure was a monument to brutalist architecture. A stark, windowless monolith of reinforced concrete that plunged deep into the desert floor. Its design was a fusion of a supermax prison and a cutting-edge laboratory, built not for rehabilitation, but for absolute, hermetic containment. The principles of supermaximum security were evident everywhere: towering perimeter walls, topped with razor wire, advanced surveillance systems monitoring every angle, and a series of airlocked sally ports that hissed open and shut with unnerving finality. Inside, the layout was deliberately disorienting, a modern labyrinth of sterile white corridors, sharp right angles, and heavy, electronically controlled steel doors. The air was recycled, carrying a faint, ozonic tang of high-voltage equipment. There was no natural light. The only illumination came from cold, recessed LED strips that cast no shadows. My new home was Echo Block, a subterranean wing of the facility. It was a single, long corridor with 8 heavily reinforced cells on one side and a row of observation stations on the other. The design was meant to eliminate all human contact. Meals were passed through slots, and movement was restricted to the point of near total stasis. I was told that inmates, referred to only as assets, were the most dangerous individuals in government custody. But the sheer level of technological overkill, the seismic dampeners beneath the floor, the complex atmospheric controls, the rows of servers humming with unimaginable processing power, suggested these were not ordinary prisoners. This was a place but to contain something that defied conventional understanding, a place operating with no legal oversight, a true black site where the normal rules of the world did not apply. My orientation concluded in a small, soundproof briefing room. My supervisor, a man named Walsh whose face was a mask of perpetual fatigue, slid a single, laminated card across the table. It was titled, "The Greystone Protocols, Echo Block." "You don't need to understand them," Walsh said, his voice flat. "You only need to obey them. Every rule is in place for a reason. Deviation is not an option. Your survival, and more importantly, the integrity of this facility, depends on your absolute compliance." The rules were a bizarre cocktail of mundane security procedures and inexplicable, almost superstitious commands. They felt less like a guard's manual and more like the ravings of a paranoid madman. Yet they were presented with the dead, serious gravity of a nuclear launch code. This juxtaposition, the clinical presentation of the utterly irrational, was the first true moment of fear I felt. It was the cold, creeping realization that I had stepped into a reality governed by a logic I could not comprehend. The Greystone Protocols, Echo Block 1. Maintain absolute silence during blue light cycles, 2200-06,000. Sound carries in ways you do not understand. 2. Ignore any sounds resembling infant cries or whispers originating from the central ventilation shaft. They are an auditory lure. 3. At 03:13 a.m., all visual monitors will switch to infrared for precisely 90 seconds. Do not look directly at the primary monitor, E7, during this time. Observe only peripherally. Direct observation is a form of engagement. 4. If a flicker of yellow light is observed in cell E4, log it as a bioluminescent event, and do not approach the cell door for the remainder of your shift. 5. Never allow your reflection to be fully and clearly visible in the observation glass of any occupied cell. Stand at an angle or partially obscure your face. 6. If the light above the primary communications panel turns blue, proceed immediately to the designated safe room via the secondary access corridor. Do not wait for confirmation. Do not use the main hallway. 7. Do not speak your name or the names of other personnel over the internal comms system. Use only designated call signs. Names have weight. 8. Under no circumstances cross the solid red line painted on the floor before cell E7. This is not a suggestion. This is a boundary of physics. I read the list twice. Each rule was a seed of dread. Rule 2 was a chilling echo of the Paiute legends of water babies, mythical spirits said to inhabit the lakes of this very region, luring people to their doom with the sound of crying infants. Rule 4's mention of bioluminescence brought to mind the strange, self-illuminating creatures of the deep ocean, things that use light to hunt or communicate in total darkness. The rules about sound and names felt connected to something ancient, a pre-scientific understanding of the world. Research into archaeoacoustics has shown that specific sound frequencies can induce feelings of fear or awe, and that ancient ritual sites were often built in places with unique sonic properties. It was as if these protocols were the scientific codification of forgotten folklore, a modern translation of ancient warnings. The myths weren't stories, they were field reports, and I was the new man on watch. My first shift in Echo Block was an 8-hour immersion in sensory deprivation. The silence was the first thing that worked its way under my skin. It wasn't the quiet of an empty house. It was an engineered, pressurized void. The recycled air, scrubbed of all scent, hummed at a frequency just below conscious hearing, a low thrum you felt in your teeth. The only other sounds were the soft electronic chime of a system cycling, the whisper of my own uniform, and the frantic thumping of my own heart. This kind of extreme isolation is a known neurotoxin. It's not just a matter of loneliness, it's a physical assault on the brain. Studies on the effects of solitary confinement show that without social interaction and environmental stimulation, neurons can literally shrink, and the hippocampus, the seat of memory and spatial awareness, begins to degrade. I could feel it happening. My thoughts grew loud and circular, my focus drifting. The long, white, featureless corridor seemed to stretch and contract. I was becoming an unreliable witness to my own reality, a classic symptom for a narrator whose perception is being warped by trauma and fear. I sat at the primary console, a bank of monitors displaying the sterile interiors of cells E1 through E8. 7 were empty, their concrete floors and steel bunks rendered in stark monochrome. Only cell E7 was occupied. The camera feed for E7 was different. A persistent, low-resolution static like an old analog television tuned to a dead channel. I could make out a shape, vaguely humanoid, but it was like looking at a figure through a blizzard. Walsh had been cleared. You don't watch the asset in E7, you watch the cell. You watch the telemetry. The asset is a variable we contain, not observe. This was the core of the job's dehumanizing protocol, to treat the being in that cell not as a person, but as a problem in physics, a force to be managed. It was a way of thinking designed to prevent the very moral injury I was trying to escape, yet it felt like a new kind of violation. The first few hours passed in a state of hyper-vigilant boredom. I logged temperature fluctuations, atmospheric pressure shifts, and power grid variances. Mundane tasks in a place that felt anything but. Then, the clock on the main display ticked to 03:01:20. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my eyes drawn to the laminated card of rules I'd propped against the console. Rule 3 at 0300 TAM. All visual monitors will switch to infrared for precisely 90 seconds. Do not look directly at the primary monitor, i.e. 7 during this time. Observe only peripherally. Direct observation is a form of engagement. At 03:300, the 8 screens flickered and switched from black and white to the ghostly, thermal palette of infrared. The 7 empty cells glowed with a faint, residual coolness. But the monitor for E7, it was a riot of heat. A figure. now sharply defined, blazed with an internal furnace that painted the screen in shades of white and searing orange. My training screamed at me to look away, but my curiosity was a physical force. I turned my head, focusing on the monitor for E4, keeping E7 in my peripheral vision as the rule dictated. Even from the corner of my eye, the image was deeply unsettling. The asset was tall, impossibly thin, and its limbs seemed to move with a disjointed fluidity that defied anatomy. It wasn't pacing. It was vibrating, a low hum, which I now realized was not coming from the facility's systems, intensified, resonating through the floor. The rule said direct observation was a form of engagement. What did that mean? Was it like the observer effect in quantum physics, where the act of measuring something changes it? Or was it something more esoteric, a principle from a rule book I couldn't begin to comprehend? The 90 seconds felt like an eternity. When the screen switched back to standard monochrome, the hum ceased, and the figure in E7 was once again a vague shape, lost in a snowstorm of static. My hands were shaking. Just as my heart rate began to settle, a new sound emerged. It was faint at first, a high-pitched mewling that seemed to come from the main ventilation, grate high on the wall opposite the cells. Rule 20. Ignore any sounds resembling infant cries or whispers originating from the central ventilation shaft. They are an auditory lure. The sound grew in volume and clarity, resolving into the unmistakable, desperate cry of a newborn baby. Every paternal instinct in my body fired at once. It was a sound hardwired into the human psyche to demand a response. I thought of the Paiute legends of this land, tales of water babies, malevolent spirits that lured people to their deaths with the sound of crying infants. The facility's founders had clearly encountered this phenomenon and codified it into a security protocol. The cries were punctuated by what sounded like whispers, sibilant and sharp, just at the edge of my hearing. Was this a psychological weapon used by one of the assets? Or was the facility itself haunted, built on ground where ancient warnings were not folklore, but literal truth? I gripped the edge of the console, my knuckles white, forcing myself to stare at the monitors, to log another meaningless temperature variance, to do anything but react to the primal, gut-wrenching sound echoing from the vent. The sound wasn't just a lure, it was a test of my ability to dehumanize myself, to suppress empathy in the name of protocol. The rest of the shift was a slow descent into paranoid speculation. What were these things? The term asset was deliberately sterile, a word used for spies or equipment, but these were living things. The bioluminescent flicker mentioned in Rule 4 suggested creatures from the deep sea, organisms that use light to communicate or hunt in total darkness. Perhaps they were extremophiles, organisms evolved to thrive in conditions no human could survive. The crushing pressure of the abyss, the vacuum of space, or the radioactive heart of a nuclear reactor. This facility, buried deep within the Nevada National Security Site, a place infamous for its secrecy and connection to black projects and UFO conspiracies, was the perfect place to house something not of this world. The stories of Area 51 and recovered alien craft, long dismissed as hoaxes, suddenly felt chillingly plausible. This wasn't a prison. It was a vivarium, a laboratory built around the cages, and we, the guards, were just another layer of containment, as expendable as the concrete walls. The labyrinthine corridors weren't just for disorientation. They were part of a larger symbolic structure, a path leading to a center where the monster was not a myth, but a subject of scientific study. My shift was ending. Walsh's replacement, a grim-faced woman named Anya, arrived with the same air of bone, deep wariness. as I was briefing her on the night's non-events, omitting, as I was sure was the unspoken rule, the infant cries and the thermal anomaly. An alarm chimed softly on the monitor for E7. The food slot at the base of the door had opened, and a metal tray was being pushed out from inside. But it was pushed too far. The edge of the tray slid across the floor and touched the solid red line painted a meter from the cell door. Rule 80. Under no circumstances cross the solid red line painted on the floor before cell E7. This is not a suggestion. This is a boundary of physics. The moment the metal tray made contact with the red paint, reality buckled. It's the only way I can describe it. The air around the line shimmered, distorting like a heat haze. A sound, like a billion glass shards grinding together, erupted from the speakers. So loud I clapped my hands over my ears. The lights in the corridor flickered violently, and the monitor for E7 went completely black. It lasted for maybe 2 seconds. Then, silence. The lights stabilized. The monitor came back online, showing the same blizzard of static. The metal tray was gone. Not pulled back, vanished. In its place, on the pristine white floor, was a black, branching pattern like a Lichtenberg figure, the scar left by a massive electrical discharge. Anya didn't flinch. She simply made a note on her datapad. Log a containment breach, level 0. Trans-dimensional shear. She looked at me, her eyes empty of anything but exhaustion. Your shift is over, Vance. Go get some sleep. You're back on in 16 hours. I walked out of Echo Block, my steps unsteady. The labyrinth had shown me another of its impossible turns. The rules weren't just for our safety. They were the laws of a reality that was bleeding into our own. And the red line was a border not between a cell and a hallway, but between what we know and what we can't possibly imagine. The 16 hours between shifts were not a reprieve. They were a different kind of confinement. My quarters were a sterile cube, identical to the thousands of others I imagined honeycombing the earth beneath me. Sleep was a shallow, fractured thing, haunted by the afterimage of the thermal flare in cell E7 and the phantom sound of grinding glass. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, the silence of my room somehow more menacing than the monitored quiet of Echo Block. It was in these hours that the true nature of my isolation began its work. The human brain is not built for this kind of sensory and social vacuum. Without external stimuli, without the complex dance of social interaction, the mind turns inward and begins to feed on itself. My thoughts became a closed loop, replaying the rules, the static on the monitor, Walsh's tired face. My sense of time began to fray. Was it my third shift or my fourth? The lack of sunlight, the constant, recycled air, the monotonous architecture. It was all designed to unmoor me from the world, to make the facility my only reality. This erosion of self was familiar. It was the same hollowing I'd felt after my military service, the signature of moral injury. That wound is a betrayal of one's own moral compass, a sense of profound shame for things done or witnessed. Here, in Persephone, the process was being refined into a science. The rules, the isolation, the deliberate dehumanization of the assets. It was all part of a protocol designed to strip away your identity, to make you a component of the machine. You weren't a person, you were call sign Echo 7. You didn't have a name, because names have weight, rule 7. You didn't have a reflection, because reflections are a form of identity, as rule 5. You were being systematically erased. And the most terrifying part was that a piece of me, the part that craved penance, welcomed the oblivion, was becoming an unreliable narrator of my own life, my perceptions skewed by trauma, fear, and a meticulously engineered environment designed to break the human mind. My next shift began with a terse handover from Anya. She mentioned a minor seismic flutter near E4, but said nothing more. The words hung in the air as I settled into the console chair. The first few hours were a study in manufactured normalcy. I logged the usual data points, the rhythmic pulse of the facility's life support. Then, a flicker of motion on the monitor for cell E4 caught my eye. It wasn't movement, it was light. Rule 40, if a flicker of yellow light is observed in cell E4, log it as a bioluminescent event, and do not approach the cell door for the remainder of your shift. It started as a single, soft point of yellow light, like a distant firefly, but it didn't blink out. It grew, expanding into a complex, shifting pattern of lines and whorls. It was organic, intricate, and utterly alien. It resembled the strange, beautiful light produced by creatures of the abyssal plane, a form of communication evolved for a world of absolute darkness. The light pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, casting strange, dancing shadows in the empty cell. I typed bioluminescent event E4 0299 into the log, my fingers stiff. The rule was clear: log it and stay away. But the light was mesmerizing. It felt like a language, a message being broadcast from a place beyond human comprehension. Was this an extremophile, an organism adapted to survive in some impossible environment, now housed in this concrete box? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Drawn by the silent, luminous display, I stood up and walked slowly toward the observation windows, my steps muffled by the sound-dampening floor. I kept my distance from E7, the red line a stark reminder of a boundary I had no desire to test again. I stopped before the window of E4. The light inside was even more vibrant up close, a swirling galaxy of gold. And then I made the mistake. Lost in the hypnotic display, I leaned forward, my face aligning perfectly with the center of the reinforced glass. For a split second, I saw my own reflection, clear and sharp against the glowing patterns within the cell. Rule 5A. Never allow your reflection to be fully and clearly visible in the observation glass of any occupied cell. Stand at an angle or partially obscure your face. In the instant my reflection became whole, the man in the glass, the other me, smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was wide, predatory, and utterly devoid of humanity. His eyes, my eyes, were black pits of ancient cold. Then, behind my reflection, another shape resolved out of the swirling light. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs too long, its form indistinct, but radiating a palpable malevolence. It reached out a long, skeletal hand and placed it on my reflection's shoulder. The me in the glass didn't flinch. He just kept smiling that terrible, knowing smile. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I scrambled back to the console, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced at the monitor for E4. The light was gone. The cell was empty, stark, and silent. There was no record of what I'd seen, no anomaly in the telemetry. It was a ghost in my own machine, a hallucination born of stress and isolation, or something far, far worse. I was seeing things that weren't there. Or perhaps, seeing things that were, through a crack in the wall of my own sanity. I was still trying to steady my breathing when a new light appeared, this one on the communications panel above the monitors. A single, round indicator, previously dark, was now glowing with a calm, steady, impossible blue. Rule 6. If the on-air light above the primary communications panel turns blue, proceed immediately to the designated safe room via the secondary access corridor. Do not wait for confirmation. Do not use the main hallway. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. There was no alarm, no klaxon, just that silent, blue light. Do not wait for confirmation. I pushed back from the console and ran, Not down the main, brightly lit corridor, but toward a small, unmarked door at the far end of the observation stations. Do not use the main hallway. The door opened into a narrow, unlit service tunnel. The air was cold and smelled of damp concrete and ozone. I pulled out my standard issue flashlight, its beam cutting a weak circle in the oppressive darkness. This was the labyrinth made real, the disorienting architecture designed not just to confuse, but to test. The corridor twisted in sharp, illogical angles, a physical manifestation of the facility's warped reality. I could hear something behind me, a faint, wet, dragging sound. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my footsteps echoing in the tight space. After what felt like an eternity of blind turns, I saw it, a heavy steel door with a single word stenciled in white bastion. I threw my weight against it, and it swung inward, revealing a small, windowless room. I stumbled inside and sealed the heavy door behind me, the locking mechanism engaging with a deafening series of clicks. The room was empty save for a single metal bench bolted to the floor and a small ventilation grate in the ceiling. I was safe. But safe from what? The silence in the bastion was different. It was absolute. The low hum of the facility was gone. There was nothing. I sat on the bench, my flashlight beam trembling on the opposite wall. And on that wall, almost invisible, were scratches. Dozens of them. Tally marks, carved into the concrete by a desperate, trembling hand. I counted them. There were hundreds. Underneath them, someone had scratched a single, frantic question. Maosh amdao and wynam. Time ceased to have meaning in the absolute silence of the bastion. The only sound was the frantic, wet rasp of my own breathing and the frantic thumping of my pulse in my ears. The air was dead and cold, stripped of even the low, omnipresent hum of the facility's life support. It was a true sensory vacuum, the kind of profound isolation known to physically damage the brain, shrinking the very neurons responsible for memory and orientation. My flashlight beam, the only point of light in a universe of concrete and steel, trembled on the far wall, illuminating the desperate scratches, tally marks, hundreds of them, a record of someone's slow descent into madness, and beneath them, the question that was now seared into my own mind on Pachik House and Wynam. I finally understood Rule 7. Do not speak your name or the names of other personnel over the internal comms system. Names have weight. This wasn't a piece of operational security to prevent eavesdropping. It was a law of physics for this place, as fundamental as the red line before cell E7. It was a principle rooted in the oldest human traditions, the belief that a name is not just a label, but an anchor, a handle, a point of connection to the soul. The man who carved this question hadn't been asking for information. He was screaming a warning. He had let something know his name, and in doing so, had given it power over him. The rules weren't just a list of procedures. They were a litany of survival, a codification of horrors discovered through trial and, undoubtedly, fatal error. The entire apparatus of Persephone, the isolation, the sterile corridors, the numbered call signs, was a system of enforced dehumanization, designed not just to control the assets, but to make the guards invisible to them. To survive here, you had to become a ghost, a non-entity. You had to erase yourself before something else did it for you. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled on the metal bench. An hour. 3. Eventually, a small green light on the door's internal lock blinked on. The all clear. I unsealed the heavy door and stepped back into the service corridor, the familiar, low hum of the facility rushing back in like a physical presence. The main hallway of Echo Block was pristine, silent, exactly as I had left it. There was no sign of disturbance, No lingering scent of ozone. No trace of whatever had triggered the silent, blue alarm. I checked the shift log on the main console. No anomalies recorded. No system alerts. According to the official record, the last few hours had been utterly uneventful. It was a perfect, seamless denial of my reality. A technique that makes you the most unreliable narrator of all. The one who is telling the truth that no one, not even the world around you, will acknowledge. My shift ended in a haze of exhaustion and dread. As I was heading for the exit, I saw Walsh leaning against a wall in the main artery corridor, his face illuminated by the cold glow of a status screen. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. On impulse, I broke my own unspoken rule of silent compliance. "Walsh," I said, my voice hoarse. The blue light. What was it? He didn't look at me at first. His eyes were fixed on the screen. "You followed the protocol. That's all that matters." "The man before me," I pressed, the words tumbling out. "The one who was on this shift. The one who carved the tally marks in the bastion. What happened to him?" Walsh finally turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond fatigue in his eyes. It was a deep, resonant grief. "He got careless," Walsh said, his voice barely a whisper. "He started to think of the asset in E7 as a person. He started talking to it. He used his name. He thought if he could understand it, he could connect with it." Walsh took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower. "That blue light isn't a physical alarm, Vance. It's not a containment breach. It's a resonance alarm. It means something in here is trying to broadcast on a frequency we don't understand. It's reaching out, and it uses whatever it can find as an antenna. Names, memories, guilt." He paused, the silence stretching between us. "The man before you gave it an antenna. He gave it his name. He gave it a way to see him." I walked back to my quarters, Walsh's words echoing in the sterile hallways. The facility wasn't just a prison. It was a shield. A dam holding back a flood of something that wasn't merely hostile, but cognitively toxic. The assets weren't just creatures. They were concepts, living ideas that could infect a mind as surely as a virus could infect a cell. The labyrinth wasn't the building's disorienting layout. It was a metaphor for the journey into the self, a path of individuation. But here, the path was inverted. The goal wasn't to find your center, to become whole. The goal was to dismantle yourself, to shed every piece of your identity, your name, your reflection, your past, until you were nothing but a function, a pair of eyes watching a screen, too smooth and empty for the resonance to find a purchase. This was the true, ultimate moral injury of Persephone. It wasn't about what you were forced to do to others, but what you were forced to do to yourself. To survive, you had to systematically kill your own soul, to become the very hollow man I had been running from. The irony was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest. I had come to this place seeking penance for the ghosts of my past, only to find myself in a place that fed on them. My next shift felt different. I was no longer just a guard following a set of bizarre rules. I was a monk performing a sacred, terrifying rite. I was a firewall, consciously blanking my mind, focusing only on the telemetry, the numbers, the data streams. I was nothing. A ghost in the machine. I sat at the console, my eyes scanning the bank of monitors. E1, empty. E2, empty. I cycled through them, a mindless, repetitive task. Then I came to E7. The screen was the same blizzard of low, resolution static it had always been. But my perception had changed. I wasn't just seeing random noise anymore. I was seeing the ghost of a signal within it. A pattern. An intelligence. Direct observation is a form of engagement. The words echoed in my mind. The asset in E7 wasn't just contained. It was listening. It was always listening. It was sifting through the electromagnetic noise of the facility, searching for a signal, for a mind to latch onto. It had found one in my predecessor, and now, I realized with a surge of ice, cold terror, it had found another in me. It had been listening to the echoes of my thoughts, the ghosts of my moral injury, the memories I had tried to bury in this desert tomb. The static on the monitor for E7 wavered, the random noise seeming to coalesce. For a single, impossible second, the image resolved with perfect clarity. It was not the face of a monster, not some alien creature. It was the face of a young man from a dusty village half a world away, a face from a memory I had replayed 1,000 times in my darkest hours. A face that was the source of the wound on my soul, and he was smiling. It was the same wide, predatory, knowing smile I had seen on my own reflection in the glass of cell E4. The internal comm speaker, silent for my entire tenure, crackled. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound. The specific, unique chime of a wind up toy soldier I had given my younger brother decades ago. A sound no one else in this facility could possibly know. The sound played for 3 seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, and into that silence, a single word was spoken. It was my own voice, perfectly replicated, but devoid of all life, all warmth. It was the voice of a ghost.
Elias,